The horse would not move. That was the thing that stopped Petra cold, 40 yards from the stable gate, her breath leaving her mouth in short white plumes, her rubber boots sinking half an inch into the frost-stiffened grass. She had heard Ember making sounds she had never heard from him in 14 months of working at Voss Farm, sounds that traveled across the open field and through the gap in the kitchen window and found her where she was standing at the sink, still holding a mug of coffee she had not yet drunk. She had set the mug down without thinking. Now she was outside, and she could see Ember at the far eastern fence line, and he was not grazing, and he was not still. He was moving in a tight, desperate circle, tossing his head with a kind of urgency that horses use when they are cornered or grieving, and his hooves were striking the hard January ground with a sound like a fist on a locked door. Over and over. The same rhythm. The same spot. And Calder Voss, who had ridden out alone 2 hours ago on a morning so cold the sky looked like hammered tin, was nowhere she could see. That should have been enough. That should have been the moment she started running. But she had been told, more times than she could count, that she read too much into what the horse did, that she was superstitious, that the bond she claimed to have with Ember was the kind of fantasy that uneducated women constructed to feel important in a world that did not give them much else to feel important about. Calder Voss had laughed when he said it. Not cruelly, exactly. Just with the comfortable ease of a man who had never once needed to be proved wrong. So Petra Halvorsen stood for 2 seconds at the fence gate, in the freezing January air, and asked herself if she was being foolish. Then she looked at Ember again, and she ran. What she found on the other side of the eastern field, in the frozen creek bed that ran along the base of the ridge, would be talked about in that valley for years. Not because it was a story people struggled to believe, but because of the detail that nobody, including Petra herself, could fully explain. 3 weeks before it happened, she had tried to tell Calder what she had noticed. He had laughed then too. He was not laughing now. The story of how Petra Halvorsen came to work at Voss Farm is not a dramatic one, and she would be the first to say so. She had come from a small city in northern Norway when she was 31, following a relationship that ended the way those relationships do, quietly and with paperwork and a division of the things they had accumulated together in 5 years. The furniture sorted by origin, and the books by preference, and the silences by a kind of mutual exhaustion that was not hatred, but felt, sometimes, like its quieter cousin. His name was Christopher, and he was a good man in most of the ways that matter, and they had simply stopped being able to give each other what they needed, which is not a tragedy, but becomes one if you stay too long past the point when you already know. She had left Norway carrying 2 suitcases and a vocational certificate in equine care, and the specific kind of clarity that arrives when you have made a decision that frightened you, and discovered that the thing you were frightened of was the staying, not the leaving. Her English was functional and slightly formal, the English of someone who had learned it from books and then learned the rest from the world, and she spoke it with a precision that American people sometimes heard as coolness, but was actually just care. She found work at a boarding stable in Virginia first, 6 months of mostly physical labor at barely above minimum wage, learning the American rhythms of a trade she already knew technically. Then a job in Kentucky with a thoroughbred operation that lasted 14 months and paid considerably better, but ended when the owner died suddenly, and the estate was liquidated with the efficiency of people who thought of horses as assets rather than animals. Then she found the listing for Voss Farm in an industry newsletter she received by email. 2 paragraphs describing a working farm in Tennessee, seeking an experienced equine caretaker with a background in difficult animals, competitive compensation, private accommodation included. She applied because of the phrase difficult animals. Most people would not have. Most people applying for farm positions use the word experience to mean comfortable, meaning they wanted work, they already knew how to do in a setting that would not require them to grow. Petra used the word experienced to mean what she understood it to literally mean, which was that she had accumulated enough encounters with enough animals to have developed a genuine competence. And that difficult was not a warning to her, but an invitation. She had spent 8 years at the riding school outside Bergen, working with exactly that kind of horse. The ones that came in from bad situations, or with bad histories, or with the particular damage that comes from being handled by people who believed that force was the same as instruction. She knew what those horses needed. She knew it was time, mostly, and consistency, and the particular willingness to be wrong about what you thought you understood without making the animal pay for your wrongness. She arrived at Voss Farm on the 15th of October and met Calder Voss for exactly 12 minutes in the farmhouse kitchen before he handed her a copy of the farm protocols and showed her to the small house on the south end of the property that would be hers. She had the impression of a tall man in his early 50s with the particular bearing of someone who had been in charge of things for long enough that authority had become postural, carried in the shoulders, and the pace of movement rather than announced. He was not unfriendly. He was precise and organized, and clearly accustomed to people understanding what was expected of them without excessive elaboration. He showed her the horses that first afternoon. The others were what she had expected from the description. 2 quarter horses used for light ranch work, reliable and indifferent in the way of horses that have been asked to do the same things for many years. A paint mare that was recovering from a leg injury and would need another 2 months of careful handling before she could be ridden. A young gelding that was skittish but trainably so, the kind of nervousness that responds to routine rather than the deeper kind that comes from something that happened that the horse has never been able to resolve. And then Ember. Calder brought her to the last stall with a neutrality in his voice that she recognized as a man preparing for something to go wrong. Ember had heard them coming. He was already at the back of the stall, turned slightly sideways, and the quality of his attention was not the braced stillness of a horse about to bolt, but something more considered than that, more deliberate. He was watching her in the particular way that horses watch when they are making a decision, scanning not just her position and her movement, but something harder to name, something about the quality of the presence she brought into the space. He was a dark chestnut, and the description on his registration papers said dark chestnut, but the papers had not been written by someone who paid close attention, because he was not simply the warm reddish brown that chestnut implies. He was darker than that in the body, almost mahogany in the shoulder and hindquarter, and his face and lower legs held a lighter color that made the contrast of him particular. And in the late afternoon light of the stable, he looked like a horse that had been assembled from different kinds of attention, some parts of him made for the world to see clearly, and some parts not. He did not come to the stall door. He did not charge it either. He stood at the back and watched her, and Petra stood at the door and watched him back, and Calder stood slightly behind her, with his arms crossed in the posture of a man, waiting to be told what he already suspected, which was that this was not going to work either. Petra stood there for 4 minutes without moving or speaking. Then she walked away from the stall. Calder uncrossed his arms. He said, "That's it." She said, "For today." He said, "I've had 2 trainers with combined 40 years of experience spend multiple sessions with this horse." She said, "I know. I read the file." She went back to her house and made dinner and did not think about Ember again until the next morning, when she went to the stable at 6:15 before the other hands arrived and stood outside his stall door in the quiet with a cup of tea she had brought from her kitchen, still warm. And she stood there for 8 minutes drinking the tea and looking at the wall and not at the horse at all. And after 4 minutes she heard him shift his weight, and after 7 minutes she heard him take 2 steps toward the door, and on the 8th minute she finished her tea and walked away again. She did this every morning for 11 days. On the 12th morning, he was already at the stall door when she arrived. She thought about this moment for a long time afterward, not because it was dramatic, it was not, but because of what it meant about the fundamental negotiation happening between them. He had not come to the door because she had done anything to invite him. She had not offered feed or touch, or the sounds that people use to coax animals into proximity. She had simply been present without agenda, without pressure, without the particular quality of wanting that horses read as easily as people read a shout. And at some point in those 11 mornings, he had decided that she was not a threat, and was not a demand, and was possibly something that he had not encountered before, which was a human being who was willing to be in his presence without requiring anything from it. That was enough for him to come to the door. It was enough for her to understand what kind of horse he was. She touched him for the first time on the 14th day, just the palm of her hand on the side of his neck, brief and unremarkable, and he did not flinch or pull back, and she moved away immediately before he could decide to. She brushed him for the first time on the 17th day. By the end of the first month, she could move around him freely in the stall. By the end of the second month, Ember had become a different animal in practical terms, not changed in character, but changed in his availability to the world, willing to be handled and ridden and groomed and led with a calm attentiveness that the other ranch hands noticed and could not fully account for. Calder noticed. He said to her one evening in early December, in the kind of brief acknowledgment he offered when something warranted it, "You've done something with that horse that nobody else has managed to do. I want you to know I see that." She said, "Thank you." He said, "I'm still not sure what you actually did." She said, "I waited." He looked at her for a moment, as if that was a more complicated answer than he had been prepared for. Then he said good night and went inside. Petra walked back to her house in the cold and thought about all the things that people tried to solve with action that were actually solved by the opposite. She had been learning this lesson in various forms for 33 years, and she was not tired of it yet because it kept arriving in new shapes, new situations, new animals and people who needed something from her that she could only give by being still. She thought Calder Voss was a man who had solved a great many things with action, and had become so practiced at it that stillness had begun to look to him like failure. She thought this without judgment. She had known many people like that. Some of them she had loved. It was in this same month, early December, that she began to notice what Ember did at the creek bend. She had not been specifically watching for it. She had been bringing him out to the eastern field each morning for his exercise, following the same routine, letting him graze along the fence line while she checked the posts and the wire for damage, a task she combined with his outdoor time because neither required her full attention and both were better in the morning light. He had a habit of moving southwest first, toward the stand of oaks at the field's corner, and then gradually working his way east along the northern fence toward the creek. She had been watching him approach the bend for several mornings before she noticed that he always stopped at the same point. Not approximately the same point. The exact same point, measured by the limestone outcropping on the bank's edge that jutted slightly above the soil like a gray tooth. He would stop with his left front hoof 6 inches from that rock every morning, without variation. She thought at first that he smelled something there, some mineral in the rock or the water below. That was the most rational explanation, and she was a rational person, and she gave it its due consideration. But the behavior that followed was not the behavior of a horse that smelled something interesting. It was something else. He would lower his head and look at the ground for a moment, and then he would stamp his left front hoof 3 times on the frozen earth, deliberate and even, and then he would raise his head and look across the creek bed at the tree line on the far bank, and he would stand very still and look. Not once, not occasionally. Every single morning, without exception, for 3 weeks. She watched it the first time and thought, that is unusual. She watched it the second time and thought, he is doing that on purpose. She watched it the seventh time and thought, something here has his attention. She watched it the 14th time and thought, I need to find out what it is. She had looked at the creek bend carefully. She had walked down the bank and stood in the creek bed in her rubber boots and looked at the limestone shelf where the ice came in from the north in winter and pooled against the rock and the undercut bank. She had looked at the configuration of it, the way the shelf angled and the way the ice would spread, and she had thought, this is a place where a person could fall and have no grip and no purchase and no way back up the bank without help. She had thought about Calder riding the eastern fence line, which he did regularly, which always brought him to this bend. She had thought about it, and then she had knocked on the farmhouse door. Calder had looked at her with a patience that was not unkind, but was not particularly warm either, and he told her that the horse was an animal, that what she was doing was taking a normal behavioral fluctuation and projecting meaning onto it because it was easier to feel connected to, something when you believed it was sending you messages. He said it with the confidence of a man who had read enough pop science to feel equipped to diagnose magical thinking in other people. Petra listened to all of it. Then she said, I'm not saying he knows something specific. I'm saying the behavior is unusual enough that I think it's worth noting. Calder said, noted. He went back inside. She stood on the porch for a moment and looked at the eastern field, at the far fence line where the creek ran, at the tree line on the far side of it, and she thought, I have said what I had to say. She had not been able to shake the thought that it was not enough, and she had kept watching. The morning Calder Voss rode out alone was the 14th of January. He had woken before 5 in the way he often did now that he was past 50, not because he needed to, but because sleep had become lighter and less reliable than it had been when he was younger. And lying still in a dark room waiting for morning felt like a kind of surrender he was not interested in making. The house was cold the way old houses are cold in January, not the punishing cold of poor insulation, but the deep, accumulated cold of thick walls that had been breathing winter air for decades. And he had put on a thermal shirt and his flannel work pants and walked to the kitchen and made coffee without turning on any lights because he knew the kitchen well enough to move through it in the dark. He stood at the kitchen window with his coffee and looked at the fields in the blue-gray light before sunrise. The sky to the east had just barely begun to separate from the land, a faint pale line above the ridge that was less light than the absence of darkness, the first signal that the night was ending. The fields were still gray-white with frost. The fence lines were shadows. The trees at the eastern edge were a dark and irregular border against the brightening sky. He felt, as he did on most mornings, the particular combination of ownership and unease that the farm seemed to produce in him. He had poured everything he had into this land for the past 6 years. Not just money, but time and attention, and the specific kind of investment that comes from deciding that a thing matters. And he had not yet decided whether it had given him anything back in a form he knew how to measure. His company had given him feedback he understood, numbers and outcomes, and the legible metrics of growth. The farm gave him something different, something that resisted quantification, and he had not made peace with that resistance yet. He thought about his father, as he sometimes did at this window in this light. His father had worked this same land for 40 years without that ambivalence. His father had not needed the farm to give him anything back. He had seemed to understand the land as something you served rather than something you owned. And in that service he had found a kind of satisfaction that Calder had watched from the outside his entire childhood and never quite understood. He understood now that he had been trying to arrive at that same satisfaction through the opposite approach. He had tried to understand the farm the way he understood his company, by analyzing and systematizing and making it legible to the kind of intelligence he had spent 30 years developing. The farm had not cooperated. He finished the coffee and set the mug in the sink. He saddled Ember himself that morning, which he did occasionally. The stable was quiet at this hour, just the low sounds of animals in the warm dark, a shift of weight, a breath, the occasional soft movement in the hay. He liked the stable in the mornings. It was one of the places on the property where he felt something close to what his father had described as simply being here, the particular quality of presence that required nothing else of you. Ember stood at the ties while Calder saddled him, and this still surprised Calder even after months of it. The stillness of the horse under his hands, the absence of the tension and resistance that had characterized every early interaction. Petra had done that. He acknowledged it to himself in the way he had been slowly learning to acknowledge things, directly and without qualification. She had done something with this animal that he himself had not been able to do, and it was worth more than the passing acknowledgment he had given it. He had been thinking for several days about saying something to her about it, something more specific than what he had said in December, something that closed the distance between the professional courtesy he had maintained and the actual truth of what he thought, which was that she was one of the most capable people he had employed in any context, and that he had not treated her capability with the respect it warranted. He kept not saying it. He had a tendency, which he was aware of, and had never fully corrected, to sit on difficult acknowledgments until they became easier. And because they rarely became easier on their own, he had a collection of them, accumulated over decades, that he had never delivered. His son Elliot knew about that collection in a personal way, and the knowledge sat between them now like furniture in a room that no one had moved. He would say something to Petra soon. He told himself this as he mounted Ember in the thin cold light of 7 in the morning, pulling his jacket collar up against the air, which was 22 degrees and still, the kind of cold that settled rather than moved, pressing against exposed skin with a patient and humorless persistence. He rode out through the western gate and turned east. The plan was simple: east fields, fence line check, down along the creek, back up through the southern gate. A route he knew so well that he could have followed it in the dark. Ember moved under him with the particular quality he had developed in the months since Petra had arrived, not the nervous high-stepping energy of an animal that was managing its own anxiety, but a forward movement that had a kind of settled intention to it, as if the horse understood where they were going and found the destination acceptable. The frost crackled under the hooves. The sky was turning from pale gray to a thin winter blue overhead, and the air tasted of cold stone and dry grass. And Calder rode through it with his hands light on the reins and his mind moving through the mornings. Concerns in the efficient way he managed things, inventory in the south barn, defense company's estimate he needed to review, the call with the bank about the property refinancing that was scheduled for Thursday. He was at the eastern fence line by 7:30. He followed the fence north toward the creek, and he felt, as he sometimes did on these rides, a version of the thing his father had described, something that arrived when you stopped directing your attention and simply let it rest on what was there. The frost on the grass catching the early light. A red-tailed hawk moving along the ridge in long, slow arcs. The smell of the creek as it came toward him on the air, mineral and cold, the particular smell of moving water in winter. He was almost at the bend when the pain arrived. He had felt it before in the weeks prior, versions of it, the dull pressure in his chest that he had attributed to posture and stress, and the accumulated wear of a body that had not been attended to particularly well. But this was different in a way that was immediately legible, even to a man who had been working hard to dismiss the previous signals. This was not pressure. This was a weight, something placed suddenly on the left side of his chest and left shoulder and arm, a dense and specific heaviness that had no structural explanation. And beneath the weight was a sensation that he would later describe to the cardiologist as the feeling of something being done to him from the inside. He pulled Ember to a stop. He sat very still in the saddle and breathed carefully and tried to assess what was happening in the way he assessed all problems, by gathering information quickly and determining the scope. His left arm had gone from heavy to numb from the elbow down. His vision was functioning, but the periphery of it had developed an uncertain quality, as if the edges of things were less committed to being where they were. He was sweating in 22-degree air. He knew what this was. He had known what the previous episodes were, at some level below the rationalizations he had constructed. He was a man of 52, with a family history of heart disease on his father's side, and a professional stress load that had never been managed in any systematic way, and a record of medical appointments that could generously be described as intermittent. He had known, and he had moved past it each time with the speed that he moved past all things that slowed him. And now he was at the bend in the Eastern Creek on a January morning in 22 degrees, and there was no moving past this. He reached for his phone. He had it in the inside left pocket of his jacket, and reaching for it required twisting slightly in the saddle, and the twist produced intensification of the chest pressure that was severe enough to take his breath, and his hand closed on empty fleece before he registered that the phone was not in the inside pocket. It was in the saddlebag, which he had used the previous afternoon when he was moving equipment in the field and had not returned to the jacket. He knew which side of the saddle the bag was on. He knew he would not be able to reach it. He thought about dismounting and retrieving it. He thought about the creek bank below him, 4 feet of slope to the limestone shelf, and the frozen water, and his left arm that was not functioning reliably. And he thought that if he dismounted, he needed to dismount carefully, and he needed to not fall, and he moved his right hand to the pommel and began, slowly, to bring his right foot from the stirrup. What happened next happened in a space of time that lasted, by his best later accounting, probably 30 seconds. But 30 seconds at the bend in the creek on the 14th of January was a larger thing than 30 seconds usually is. Ember moved, not forward and not back, and not in a direction that Calder, in his diminishing state, had any context for. The horse shifted his weight hard to the left, in a kind of lateral step that Calder had never felt him make before, and it was a step that had an effect on Calder's dismount that he was not prepared for, catching him mid-movement, and the next thing Calder understood was the cold of the limestone shelf against his face, and the cold of the creek water against his right hand, and the cold of everything, the entire world reduced to cold, and the thin sound of his own breathing, which was shallow and very far away. He heard, or believed he heard, the sound of hooves somewhere above him, steady, rhythmic, insisting. He did not know if he was conscious in any useful sense. He did not know what Ember was doing above him on the bank, or what the horse was seeing, or what the horse understood about the situation. He had no framework for thinking about what the horse understood. He had explicitly rejected the framework that would have allowed him to think about it, but the sound was there, and it was regular. And in the shrinking world of his awareness, it was the one thing that had direction. He focused on it the way a person focuses on a light. He did not know how much time passed. He did not know that Ember was not simply standing above him. He did not know that Ember had positioned himself at the top of the bank in a way that blocked the most obvious point of egress from the creek bed, the angle at which a spooked or indifferent horse would have left, and that he had been making a sound that Petra had heard from 300 yards away in the kitchen of the small house on the south end of the property where she had been standing, at the sink with a cup of coffee she had not yet drunk. He did not know she was running. He held on to the sound. He held on to the sound because it was the only thing in the world that still had a shape he could locate. And the shape was regular and insistent, and it did not stop. It kept arriving, 3 beats, and then 3 beats, and then 3 beats, exactly like a thing that was not going to leave, exactly like a thing that intended to be heard. 3 beats, 3 beats, 3 beats. He had been told they didn't mean anything. He held on to them anyway. Petra was in the stable at 7:43 when something shifted in the air in a way she could feel before she could explain. She had been doing the morning feed, working her way down the row of stalls with a focused quiet that she preferred to conversation, and she had the radio on low in the tack room at the end of the building, a country station she didn't particularly care about, but found useful as a kind of auditory wallpaper that kept the silence from becoming heavy. The horses were settled, moving through the early morning rhythms of the stable, the shifting of weight and the soft percussion of tails, and the occasional low sound that was contentment rather than distress. She had almost reached the last stall when she stopped and stood very still. It took her 4 seconds to understand what she was hearing. The sound was coming from the eastern field, traveling on the flat cold air in the particular way that sound travels in winter, clearly and without distortion, and it was Ember, and it was not a sound she had heard him make before. Not the high distress call she had heard the one time another horse had gotten into his paddock and they had briefly fought, which had a quality of alarm to it, of surprise. Not the low, anxious repetition he made in thunder, which was rhythmic but without direction. This was different. This had a pattern to it that was purposeful in the way that signals are purposeful when the thing making them has run out of subtlety and moved to something more direct. She was outside before she had fully decided to go. The cold hit her immediately. She was in her stable clothes, a thermal under a canvas work jacket, and her rubber boots, and she had not stopped for her heavier coat, and she knew from the quality of the air that the temperature was still below 25, and that running in 25-degree air without proper coverage was going to cost her. But she made the calculation without slowing. She was at the fence gate in 40 seconds. She stopped for 2 of those seconds to scan the field and locate Ember, and she found him at the far eastern fence, at the bend in the creek, and he was doing what she had been watching him do every morning for 3 weeks, except more. He was moving in that tight, desperate circle, tossing his head with a kind of urgency that exceeded anything she had seen, and he was striking the ground with his hooves in that rhythmic, insistent pattern, and his sounds were carrying, and he was not stopping, and there was no rider visible anywhere in the field. The gate was latched. She unlatched it and went through and started running. The field between her and the creek bend was 310 yards across frozen ground, and her rubber boots were not made for this surface, the frost still hard under a thin skin of beginning thaw, and she went down twice in the first 100 yards, once on her right knee and once on both hands, and she got up each time without stopping, because stopping was not a thing she was considering. There are things that a body does when the thinking part of the mind steps back that a person could not consciously direct, and this was one of them. She was not thinking about Calder, or about what she would find. She was not assessing probabilities or running scenarios. She was running because the horse at the creek bend was Ember, and Ember had been standing at that bend every morning for 3 weeks, and the morning had come when he was not standing at it calmly. She had known, in the part of her that had kept watching after being told to stop watching, that the morning was going to come. As she got closer, she could see that Ember was not just circling. He was positioned at the top of the creek bank, leaning his body toward the drop, and he was looking down, and his sounds had changed. Lower now, more urgent, the difference between calling for something and calling to something. She reached the fence line and vaulted the lower rail, which she caught with both hands and swung over, and she scrambled down the creek bank using the frozen grass as handholds, and she saw Calder, Voss lying face down in the frozen creek bed with one arm extended toward the limestone shelf where the ice had broken through. He was not moving. The left side of his face was against the stone. His right hand was in an inch of running water. His jacket had ridden up on the right side, exposing his lower back to the air, and the skin there was already the color and quality of something that had been cold for too long. Petra was on her knees in the creek bed, before she had a thought in her head at all. She put both hands on his right shoulder, and she rolled him. And he was heavy in the way that unconscious men are heavy. Not resistant, but completely passive. A weight that had no interest in helping itself. And getting him onto his back required 2 full efforts. Her knees against the limestone shelf, and the ice water soaking through her pants. And she got him there, and she checked his airway, and she pressed 2 fingers to his neck. The pulse was there. It was wrong in a way she could not precisely name. Too slow, irregular in a specific way. Not the randomness of a problem, but the pattern of a muscle that was struggling, like a drum being played by someone with a compromised hand. She knew what that felt like. She had taken a basic cardiac first aid course at the riding school in Bergen 8 years ago, the kind of practical safety training that people who work in isolated rural settings take, because they are aware that the distance to an emergency service is not abstract. She had not used that training since. She used it now. She tilted his head back to ensure the airway was clear. She checked his color, which was wrong, grayish at the lips. She checked his breathing, which was shallow and slow but present. She noted the position of his body and checked for obvious injury from the fall, and found a bruise forming at the left temple and an abrasion on the right palm from the limestone. She did not have her phone. She stood and looked back across the field toward the farmhouse, which was 300 yards away, and she looked at the man at her feet with his irregular pulse and his wrong color, and she did the arithmetic. She could run for the house and call 911 and come back, and the ambulance from the nearest station was at minimum 22 minutes away from the moment of the call. She would need 4 minutes to reach the house. She would need to find someone with a phone or reach the farmhouse landline. If everything went perfectly, she would be back at the creek bed in 11 or 12 minutes, and the ambulance would arrive 33 minutes after that. 45 minutes. In 22 degrees. With those pulse readings, she looked up at Ember. He had stopped circling. He was standing at the top of the bank above her, and he was looking at her directly, with that quality of assessment she knew so well. The quality that was not human, but was not less than human. Just different, operating on frequencies that human perception did not routinely process. She put her hand on the bank above her head, and she stood, and she reached up and put her palm on the side of his neck, and she held it there for a long moment. She did not speak. She let him feel where she was, and what was happening, and what she needed. She stepped back from the bank. She pointed toward the farmhouse, and she said, in a low, indirect voice, the 3 words she had said to him before, when she needed him to go somewhere without her. Go on, Ember. She had said those words to him 14 times over 14 months in the paddock and the stable and the field. He had responded to them 11 of those times in the way she intended, by moving ahead of her toward the indicated direction. 3 times he had stood still and looked at her with that quality of assessment, and then moved at his own discretion in his own time. She had never said them in a situation that was not routine. She had never said them from the bottom of a creek bank, with her knees wet with creek water, and a man unconscious at her feet. He looked at the farmhouse. He looked at her. He looked at the farmhouse again. Then he went. Not uncertain, not startled, but with the purposeful quality that she had come to recognize as his register of decision, his body language when he had assessed something and resolved to act. He went in a straight line across the field, not along the fence line but directly toward the buildings, at a gallop that covered the ground without deviating. She watched him go. She turned back to Calder, and she sat on the bank above him, and she put her jacket across his chest, and she pressed her fingers to his neck again, and she sat there in the freezing creek bed, and she waited. Trevin Gaines had been at Voss Farm for 14 months, hired 6 weeks after Petra, and he was a 26-year-old from a small town in Mississippi who had grown up around horses and had the particular relationship to them that rural Southern men of his generation developed, useful and matter-of-fact, and not given to interpretation. He liked Petra and gave her a wide professional berth in the way of a person who recognized expertise and did not feel threatened by it. And he had watched the changes in Ember with the attentive puzzlement of someone who could not fully account for what he was seeing, but was honest enough to acknowledge it. He was in the equipment barn at 7:49, running a diagnostic on the track hoe that had been making a noise he didn't like when he heard the fence. He came out of the barn and stood in the yard and looked at Ember hitting the fence rail that bordered the paddock nearest the farmhouse. And he understood in approximately 3 seconds that something was badly wrong. The horse was not panicked, not disoriented, not showing the random high-energy behavior of an animal that had been frightened. He was doing something that looked, and Trevin would say this to the other hands later, and would not take it back despite the uncertain responses it received, like a horse that was trying to get someone's attention. Trevin ran for the farmhouse. He called 911 at 7:51 in the morning. He came out of the farmhouse and ran for the eastern field, and he could see, from the gate, Petra at the bottom of the creek bank, and he went across the field without stopping, and he came down the bank and stood beside her, and she did not look up. She said, "Keep talking to him. Let him hear a voice." She said it the way she said things, without urgency in the tone, but with a precision that communicated that the instruction was not optional. Trevin crouched beside Calder Voss, and he talked. He said things that he could not have recounted afterward, because he was not thinking about what to say. Just talking, the sound of a voice at normal volume in a frozen creek bed at 22 degrees, the most ordinary thing. Petra kept her fingers at the pulse that was wrong, and her jacket across the chest as she watched the sky begin to complete its transition to full winter blue, and she waited. The paramedics arrived at 8:29. In the time between Petra reaching Calder in the creek bed and the paramedics arriving, she did not leave him. She kept her fingers at his neck and monitored the pulse that continued to be present, but continued to be wrong. She spoke to him after Trevin had done it for a while, not because she thought he could hear her, but because she had said to herself, in the riding school in Bergen all those years ago, that the thing you do for an unconscious person at normal volume is the same thing you do for a horse who cannot yet decide to trust you. You make a sound that says, "I am here, and I am not leaving, and I am not afraid," and you say it for as long as it takes, and you do not stop just because you have no way to know if it is being received. She talked about Norway, mostly. About the light in summer in the north of the country, which is not like light anywhere else. Not fully dark at midnight, a long blue twilight that makes the nights feel like pauses rather than endings. She talked about the smell of the sea from the hills behind the town where she grew up, and about her grandmother's kitchen, and about the specific quality of silence in a Norwegian winter that is different from the silence in other places. Fuller somehow, as if the snow has weight that sound cannot pass through. She talked about Saga, the gray mare from Bergen, who had been her first, who had taught her what she knew about patience and attention, and the kind of trust that could not be manufactured. She did not know if he heard any of it. She did not know, and would not know for 8 more days, what he would tell her. The paramedics came down the creek bank with a board and equipment, and they worked with the focused efficiency of people trained to function in situations that would paralyze most others, and they got a reading and placed in 4 and stabilized him, and got him up the bank and across the field on the board. And they told Petra she had done the right things and that she could ride in the ambulance if she was family. She said she was not family. She said, "He lives alone. Can you call his assistant? Her name's in the farmhouse on the kitchen whiteboard." They said they would. She watched the ambulance go down the farm road. She stood in the frozen field and felt the adrenaline of the previous 46 minutes finishing its work through her body, the slight trembling of hands and knees that follows, the particular exhausted clarity that arrives after something has happened that could not have been prepared for. She looked at the eastern fence. She looked at the creek bend. She thought, 3 weeks every morning. She looked at Ember, who had made his way back to the eastern fence and was standing at the top of the bank above the creek bed, looking down, not circling, not making sounds, just standing there and looking at the place where the man had been. She walked back across the field. She reached the fence, and she leaned on the top rail, and she looked at the horse, and the horse looked at her, and she said nothing for a long time, and he stayed. Then she said, quietly, "Good boy." He did not react the way a dog reacts to praise. He was not that kind of animal. But he turned his head and looked at the tree line across the creek, and then back at her, and she had the thought that he was checking, making sure the thing he had been watching for was not still there. She thought, he knew. He knew for 3 weeks. She thought, I know that. And Calder doesn't. And then she thought, he will. She went back to the stable to finish the morning feed. The first thing the emergency physicians at the hospital established was that Calder Voss had experienced a significant cardiac event, specifically a partial occlusion of the left anterior descending artery, which had produced what the cardiologist described as a severe ischemic episode, a reduction of blood flow to the heart muscle that had caused loss of consciousness, and had it continued without intervention for much longer, would in all likelihood have produced a more complete event with a much lower probability of recovery. The second thing they established, checking against his medical records and the information his assistant provided, was that Calder had shown 3 previous warning episodes in the past 2 months, each of which he had attributed to something else and not reported. A pain in his chest during a phone call that he had blamed on coffee. A tingling in his left arm after lifting a fence post that he had attributed to the exertion. A brief episode of dizziness one evening that he had decided was dehydration. He had noticed all of them. He had dismissed all of them. The cardiologist told him this in the hospital with a directness that Calder privately appreciated. She was a woman in her 40s named Dr. Fenwick, with the manner of someone who had delivered difficult news enough times to have become precise about it rather than soft. She told him that the delay in seeking care had narrowed his margin considerably. She told him that the outcome, given the temperature, the location, and the time elapsed, was not the expected outcome. She told him this not to frighten him, but because she believed in people having accurate information about their own situations. He lay in the hospital bed and looked at the ceiling and thought about that. He thought about all of it, about the creek bed, about the cold of it, and about the fact that the last thing he remembered before the dark came was the sound of hooves somewhere above him, a steady, rhythmic sound, like someone insisting. He thought about lying there and not knowing whether help was coming and deciding, without exactly choosing, to focus on the one thing that still had direction. He thought about what it had cost him to stay present, and about the fact that what had kept him anchored was a sound that he had been told was meaningless. He thought about meaningless. He had used the word himself, not to Petra, not directly, but in the shape of what he had said to her, in the confidence he had brought to his dismissals, which was not cruelty, but had functioned as cruelty, because the effect was the same regardless of the intention. He had told her that what she observed was not what she thought it was, and he had told her this from a position of authority that had nothing to do with horses and everything to do with the accumulated weight of being a certain kind of man in a certain kind of role for a very long time. He had built his company on the ability to move quickly through complexity, to pull signal from noise, to act on incomplete information, better than most people could act on complete information. That ability had served him well for 30 years. It had produced everything he had. He had trusted it without examining it, the way you trust the instrument that has never failed you, without thinking about the contexts in which it might. The context it had failed in was this one. The context of paying attention to something at normal volume, without urgency, without a clear call to action, without anything obvious at stake. His chest had spoken to him 3 times in 2 months, and he had moved through it each time with the speed of a man who had trained himself to categorize and dismiss. The horse had spoken to him every morning for 3 weeks from a specific location, and he had been told about it and categorized it as someone else's error and dismissed it. He lay in the hospital and thought about the cost of that. He had 3 stents placed in the first surgery 2 days after admission. He was moved from the cardiac ICU to a standard room on the 4th floor by day 4. He was awake for most of it, and he had visitors. His operations manager came with a folder of things that needed signatures, and the barely concealed discomfort of a man who did not know how to be in a hospital and had brought work as protective armor. 2 of his ranch hands came together on a Wednesday afternoon and stood at the foot of the bed with their hats in their hands and said that everything at the farm was fine and that he should focus on getting better, and the sincerity of it moved him in a way he had not been prepared for. A woman from his church named Doreen arrived on Thursday with a jar of honey she had made herself, dark amber and intensely sweet, and she sat in the visitor chair for 40 minutes and talked about her own husband's health episode 3 years ago, in a way that was practically useful rather than emotionally performative, and he found himself grateful for the information. He appreciated all of it. He appreciated it in a way that felt different from appreciation he had felt before, cleaner somehow, more direct, as if a layer had been removed between the experience and the feeling it produced. But the person he kept thinking about was Petra. She had come once, on day 3, when he was still in the ICU. She had stood at the doorway in the particular way she had, that quality of occupying space without demanding it, not quite still, but not restless either. A person who had become comfortable with her own presence, not because she was confident in the general sense, but because she had learned through long practice that her presence was not a problem to be managed. She had asked if he needed anything. He had said no. She had nodded once, precisely, and left. The interaction was brief and correct, and when he looked at the space she had vacated, he understood, with a clarity that was probably the product of whatever clarity a cardiac ward can produce in a person, that he had constructed the brevity and correctness of their relationship himself. He had done it carefully and consistently, and without examining his motives, which were not what he would have claimed they were. He would have claimed that he maintained professional distance because it was appropriate, and because the power differential made other kinds of distance irresponsible. Those things were true, but underneath them was something else, which was that Petra Halvorsen was a person whose perceptions he found disturbing, not because they were wrong, but because they were often right about things that he had already decided the meaning of, and it was easier to maintain a certain kind of distance from someone whose rightness threatened your certainties than to let them close enough to keep being right. He thought about Elliot. His son was 31 now and lived in Seattle and called twice a year at Christmas and at Calder's birthday, and the calls had a quality of managed politeness that hurt in a specific way, not because Elliot was unkind. He was not, but because the politeness was load-bearing. It was doing the work of holding the distance in place, and they both knew it, and neither of them had been willing to disassemble it, because disassembling it would require having a conversation that Calder had not been ready for. The conversation was about a particular set of things that had happened that Elliot was 16 and 17, in the years when Calder's company was at its most demanding, and Calder himself was at his least available, and about the specific ways in which a father's unavailability communicates things to a son that the father did not intend to communicate, but communicates nonetheless, loudly, at normal volume, over and over, until the son stops waiting to be heard differently. Elliot had stopped waiting when he was 19 or 20. Calder had noticed in the way he noticed his symptoms, and had attributed it to something easier, the natural independence of a young man, the distance that adults achieve from their families as a sign of health rather than damage. He lay in the hospital and looked at the ceiling. He thought, how many things have been speaking to me, and I have been the wrong instrument to receive them. He thought about what it meant that an animal who had no language and no abstract capability and no ability to construct a narrative about the importance of what it was perceiving had nonetheless perceived something and communicated it in the only way available to it, persistently at the same location every morning for 3 weeks, and that the only person paying attention had been told she was wrong. He thought about that for a long time. He thought about what she had said to him in January before all of it, how she had framed it carefully, how she had said, "I'm not claiming it means anything specific. I'm saying the behavior is unusual enough to note." How precise that had been. How genuinely scientific, in the best sense of that word, which is the willingness to report an observation without demanding it conform to a predetermined conclusion. He had told her she was constructing patterns. He had been wrong. He thought about how it felt to have been wrong in a way that had nearly cost him his life, and about how different that felt from being wrong in a meeting, or wrong in a business decision, or wrong about the weather. Those wrongnesses were recoverable. They left lessons and moved on. This one had a different quality. This one had a permanence to it, because the rightness that he had dismissed had turned out to be the kind of rightness that a person only demonstrates once, under the conditions that tested it, and those conditions had come, and the demonstration had been made, and he had not been able to revise it before it mattered. She had been right. He had been wrong. And in the space between those two facts was a creek bed in January, at 22 degrees, and a horse that stamped 3 times every morning for 3 weeks, and a woman who had watched it and reported it and been dismissed, and then had run 300 yards in rubber boots across frozen ground without hesitating, and had found him and stayed with him and folded her jacket across his chest, because that was all she had. He owed her something real for that. He was working out what form it should take. The answer, when it came to him, was simple in the way that honest things usually are. He owed her the acknowledgement that she had been right. Not a thank you, although that too, but the specific acknowledgement. I was wrong, and you were right, and what I dismissed was real. He had not yet said this to her. He was going to say it on the 8th day. On the 8th day, Petra came again. She did not bring anything. She came at 10 in the morning. During the visitor hours, she had looked up on the hospital's website, and she wore the same coat she wore to buy groceries, the dark green one with the broken zipper on the left pocket that she had been meaning to replace for a year and a half. She sat in the chair beside the bed without waiting to be told to sit. Calder looked at her for a moment. Then he said something she had not expected. He said, "I owe you more than an apology, but I want to start there." Petra said nothing. He said, "I've been thinking about what I told you, about the horse, about what you were seeing. I was dismissive in a way that wasn't honest, and it wasn't right." She looked at him carefully. She was trying to determine whether he was saying what he was saying because he had been frightened or because he meant it. The difference mattered to her. She had been told things by people who were frightened before, and the things they said from that place did not always stay true when the fear receded. He seemed to understand the question without her asking it. He said, "I want to tell you something about what I remember from the creek bed." She sat still. He said, "I don't know how long I was conscious enough to hear anything. Maybe not at all, in a way that the doctors would count. But there was a sound, before everything went quiet. A sound that was regular and insistent, and it was from above me, and it was the only thing in the whole field that felt like it had a direction." He paused. He said, "I don't know if I was following it or just holding on to it, but it was there. And I don't think I would have stayed as long as I did without it." Petra was quiet for a moment. Then she said, he was at that bend every morning, 3 weeks before it happened. Every morning, the same place, the same 3 stamps of his hoof. I noticed it in late December. Calder looked at her. She said, I tried to tell you. You said I was finding patterns that weren't there. He was quiet long enough that the machines in the room had time to make several sounds. And he said, I know. They sat together in the hospital room for a while after that. Not talking, mostly. The kind of silence that had changed its quality, that had become something other than distance. Before she left, she told him about Saga, the gray mare from Bergen, the first horse she had built that specific language with, the one who had taught her that patience and attention, applied long enough and honestly enough, produced a kind of knowing that had nothing to do with mysticism and everything to do with simply paying attention to what was actually in front of you. She told him that she had not given Ember any special gift. She had just not decided in advance that what he was doing did not mean anything. Calder looked at the window. He said, I'm going to need to get better at that. He came home on day 12. The temperature had climbed back into the 40s, and the ice in the creek bed had softened, and the land had the particular quality of mid-January in Tennessee, not quite winter, and not yet anything else, held between seasons, waiting. Petra had the house ready. She had not been asked to do this. She had done it because it was the thing that needed doing, because there was an order to practical care that she understood the way she understood horses, not through instruction, but through the slow accumulation of attention. Trevin drove him from Nashville and helped him up the porch steps, and Calder stood at the door of his house for a moment before going in, looking at the fields, looking at the eastern tree line where the creek ran. The sky was pale and enormous, and a hawk was turning slow circles above the ridge. He found a note on the kitchen table. It was from Petra. It told him the feed schedule for the week and the vet appointment she had rescheduled to the following Tuesday, and the fact that the southeast fence gate latch had been stiff and needed oil. At the bottom, in the same careful handwriting as the rest, she had added one line. It said, Ember has been good. He's been watching for you. Calder sat in the kitchen chair and held the note for a while. He thought about the farm, about his father, who had worked this land without drama or mythology, who had believed that what the land asked of you was presence, not understanding, just showing up and staying and putting your attention where it needed to be. He thought about the years he had spent building his company, the efficiency of it, the way he had trained himself to move quickly past things that couldn't be quantified. He thought about his son Elliot, who was 31 now and lived in Seattle, and called twice a year with a politeness that hurt more than anger would have, because the politeness meant that the gap between them had become permanent enough to manage rather than close. He thought about what the cardiologist had said about margins. He thought about the creek bend, about a horse that stopped there every morning for 3 weeks, stamping 3 times in the frost, watching something across the tree line that no one else had bothered to look at. He thought about the woman who had looked at it and been told she was wrong and kept looking anyway. The winter passed. Calder recovered slowly, which was the only speed available to him. He went for walks, then longer walks, then eventually rides, short ones at first, building back up with a patience that was new to him and not entirely comfortable. He made the call to Elliot that he had been constructing in his head for 2 years, and it was painful in the way that honest things often are, and it did not fix anything immediately. But something shifted in the architecture of the distance between them. Some load-bearing thing gave a fraction, and that seemed like enough. He increased Petra's pay without being asked. He arranged for the stable to be updated in a way that she had suggested in November, and that he had declined at the time. He started coming out to the eastern field in the mornings, not to ride, just to be there. And he stood at the fence rail in the early light, the way she had told him she used to stand, without agenda, without forcing anything. Ember came to him on the third morning. Not all the way, not without hesitation, but enough, stopping 6 feet from the rail and standing there with that quality of fierce consideration in his eyes. And Calder stood still and let him look and did not try to close the remaining distance. He was learning. He watched Petra work. He watched the way she moved through the stable, the way she listened to the horses without making them speak more clearly than they were able to, the way she received information and did not immediately interpret it. He understood that what he had called projection was something more disciplined than that. It was observation that had no investment in a predetermined conclusion. He had thought of it as a weakness because he had been trained to move toward certainty, to draw conclusions quickly and act on them, and what she did was the opposite of that. He had almost died because he was the opposite of that. He thought about his own symptoms, the pain in the chest during the phone call, the tingling in the arm, the dizziness. 3 signals, clear and concrete, and he had moved through all of them so quickly that they had barely left a mark. He had interpreted them before he had felt them, and the interpretations had been wrong, and he had almost paid a price that could not be recovered. He thought about Ember at the creek bend. 3 stamps every morning. 3 weeks of a signal that a person who was paying attention had noticed, and a person who was not had been too certain to receive. There are people who hear things only when the volume is turned all the way up. Calder was beginning to understand that he had been one of them, and that the world and the people in it, and the animals in it, had been speaking to him at normal volume all his life. Spring came in early and uncertain, the way it does in that part of Tennessee, warm mornings that retreated to cold afternoons, the creek running with the snowmelt from the ridge, the fields slowly releasing the frost and turning back to mud, and then to something greener. Petra planted a kitchen garden along the south wall of the farmhouse. This had not been discussed. She had simply assessed the soil and the sun exposure and purchased the seeds and begun. Calder saw her working on it one morning from the kitchen window and felt something he could not fully name, some combination of gratitude and recognition, the sense of being in the presence of someone who fixed things not because they were instructed to, but because the fixing was what they understood to be their purpose. He had thought for a long time that purpose was something you constructed, built deliberately from ambition and plan and will. He had built his company that way, through intention, and it had worked. And the success of that approach had convinced him that it was the only approach. Watching Petra turn the soil along the south wall, he was less certain. He had not constructed the way she worked. She had not constructed it. She had simply arrived with it and remained true to it, even when people like him had told her it was not worth trusting. That took something, he thought. That took a kind of courage that was quieter than the kinds he had previously admired. On the last Saturday in April, Calder asked Petra to ride with him to the eastern field. She hesitated for a moment, which he understood. He said, "I want to see the bend." They rode out together in the mid-morning, when the light was already strong and the grass was high enough in the field to brush against the horse's legs. Petra was on a bay named Colt, who was unremarkable and comfortable. Calder was on Ember, and Ember went willingly, which still produced in Calder something that he suspected he would never take for granted again. At the creek bend, Calder stopped and dismounted. He walked to the edge of the bank and looked down at the creek bed, which was running with maybe 6 inches of water now, clear over the limestone. The spot where the ice had given way, just another piece of creek bank, ordinary and unmarked, distinguishable from the surrounding land only by the fact that he knew what it was. He stood there for a long time. Petra let him. After a while, he turned and looked at Ember, who had come to stand beside him at the bank without being led, and he put his hand on the horse's neck, and he felt, as he sometimes did now, the particular quality of presence that a horse produces, the enormous and impersonal warmth of a living thing that simply is, without agenda, without judgment, without any investment in whether you have been good enough, or right enough, or present enough. He said to Petra, without turning, "How long did it take you to build this?" "With him," she said. "The whole time." He nodded. He said, "I want to understand how you do it." Petra was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You already do. You're standing here." He turned and looked at her. She said, "Most of it is just not walking away when something is hard to read. Standing still long enough to let it become clear." He looked back at the creek, at the water moving across the limestone, at the ordinary way of it, the unremarkable surface of a place where something had happened that changed the rest of his life. He thought about margins, about signals, about how many things had been speaking to him at normal volume for decades before he had arrived. Finally, at a creek bed in January, at a temperature that did not leave room for error, and been forced to hear. In June, a writer from a regional magazine contacted the farm after a version of the story circulated in the area through the kind of telephone that small communities maintain without quite acknowledging. She wanted to write a piece about the horse. Calder said no, not because he was protecting himself, but because he was not sure the story belonged in a magazine. What he told her on the phone briefly was that the real story was not about the horse. A horse had done what horses do, which is pay attention to what is actually in front of them without deciding in advance what it means. The story, if there was one, was about the person who had been watching the horse do it for 14 months and had the patience and conviction to keep watching even when she had been told, clearly and repeatedly, that she was wrong. He said the horse was the instrument. She was the one who knew how to read it. He did not think she heard this. She had not been in the room when he said it. He thought about calling her in to tell her, and then he thought, she already knows. She knew before I did. She has known this entire time. He thought about what it costs to know something clearly and to keep carrying it in the face of the certainty of people who are wrong. He thought he was beginning to understand. Summer settled over Voss Farm with the particular weight of Tennessee in July, thick and green and insistent, the days long and humid, the mornings briefly cool before the heat arrived. Calder rode every day now, not long rides, not yet, but steady ones. The cardiologist's guidelines on his phone, like a schedule he had made peace with. He had learned to listen to his body in the way he had learned to stand at the fence line, without rushing toward an interpretation. It was not natural to him. It required effort every single day. He did not think it would ever stop requiring effort. He was beginning to think that this was not a problem. Trevin had started to help Petra with the stable in the mornings, not because he had been assigned to, but because he had started to pay attention to what she did in the way that people start to pay attention to someone who is clearly good at a thing. She had not encouraged this, and had not discouraged it. She had simply continued to do the work and let it be visible. Calder watched this from a distance and thought about what it meant that he had employed this woman for 1 year and 4 months before he had understood what she was actually capable of. He thought about how much of what is around us we decide the meaning of before we have actually looked. He thought about Elliot. The conversations they were having now, careful and slow and honest in a way their conversations had not been in a long time. He thought about his father, who had stood on this same land and worked it without understanding it, and had loved it anyway, and about whether love was possible before understanding, or whether what he had thought of as love had been something else, possession maybe, or habit. He thought about what it felt like to lie in a creek bed at 22 degrees, with an uncertain heartbeat, and hear, coming from above him through the fog of nearly gone consciousness, the sound of a horse insisting. He thought, I did not earn that. He thought, I was given it anyway. On the last evening in August, Petra found a card on her kitchen table. She lived in the small house on the property's south end that had been part of her employment arrangement, a 2-room structure with a garden that was hers to manage and a window over the sink that faced the eastern field. She had not expected anything on her table. She picked up the card. It was handwritten. Calder's handwriting was angular and careful, the handwriting of a man who had been taught penmanship before keyboards. It said, "I've been thinking about how to say something that should have been said a long time ago. I've decided to just say it directly. You were right. About the horse. About the bend. About the 3 weeks before. You were right, and I was wrong, and I said things to you that treated your knowledge as a problem with your thinking, and it wasn't. It was knowledge I didn't have and couldn't recognize because I had decided it wasn't possible. You saved my life. So did Ember. But Ember saved my life because you taught him that someone in this world was going to pay attention to what he was actually saying. You gave him that. And then, when it mattered, you gave it to me too. I won't forget that." Petra set the card down on the table. She stood at the window for a long time, looking at the eastern field, at the far fence line where the creek ran. The light was almost gone, just a pale stripe above the ridge, and the field was dark and still and quiet in the way it was in the last hour before full night. After a while, she picked up the card and folded it once and put it in the pocket of her coat, the one with the broken zipper, the pocket that always stayed closed. She did not tell him, not that summer, and not that fall, and not when the winter came back around and the creek bent again under ice. She did not tell him that Ember had been standing at that bend, stamping 3 times, every single morning for the 3 weeks before it happened. She did not tell him because he already knew. He had heard it from her once in the hospital, and she had watched it land in him and settle, that piece of information, the specific weight of it, the way it changed the shape of everything that had come before. She did not think a thing like that needed to be said again. But on mornings, when the light came in clear and early, and she brought Ember out to the eastern field and walked with him along the fence line toward the creek, she would stop at the bend and stand beside him, and they would stand there together looking at the water moving across the limestone, unhurried, unchanged, and she would think he knew, before any of us, before the symptoms, before the silences, before the certainty of people who are wrong. He stood at this exact place, and he told us in the only language he had, as clearly and as persistently as he was able. And she had been listening. That was the whole of it, really. That was the only difference between what she was and what Calder had been in that long year before the creek. She had been listening, and she had not stopped.